Okay, so today we are diving deep into capitalism versus communism. Two systems that really shaped the 20th century.
Yeah.
And you've given us some fascinating material here. We've got stuff that covers the Industrial Revolution, the Cold War, even what's happening today.
It's a broad sweep of history.
It is. It's like we're about to watch a battle of ideas unfold right in front of us.
It really is. And you know what's interesting to me?
What's that?
Is that both capitalism and communism kind of grew out of the same historical conditions.
So interesting.
Yeah, it's like two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
Each offering a different answer to the same question.
What's the question?
How do we deal with the problems of industrial society?
I like that. So let's set the stage then.
Okay.
Let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
What's going on in the world?
Well, massive change.
Massive change.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing.
Okay.
We've got cities growing like crazy, new technologies popping up everywhere.
It's a time of incredible innovation.
It is, but
Right.
there's a huge problem.
What's
This
that?
gap between the rich and the poor.
Right. So capitalism is creating wealth, but it's also creating some pretty serious inequality.
Exactly. And that's where a guy named Karl Marx
Oh, yeah, Karl Marx.
enters the picture.
This is where he comes in.
He was living in a time where the downsides of capitalism were just impossible to ignore.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Worker exploitation,
Okay.
dangerous working conditions,
Yeah.
A tiny elite controlling all the wealth.
Right. But Marx wasn't just complaining about this, was he?
No, he wasn't just a complainer.
He was trying to come up with a solution.
Yeah, he was developing a whole new system,
A whole new
a whole new way of thinking about economics and politics.
Okay, so he wanted to completely change everything, not just tweak it.
Exactly. He believed that capitalism was fundamentally flawed, based on exploitation.
Right.
And eventually it would just collapse
Just self-destruct.
under its own weight.
Under its own contradictions.
Yeah, that was his prediction.
Okay, and his solution?
Communism
Communism, a system that...
aims to get rid of private property altogether
Whoa.
and create a classless society.
No classes at all.
No, everyone shares the means of production and the fruits of their labor, everything.
Sounds pretty radical, especially for the time.
It was radical.
But given what was going on,
Yeah.
you can see why people would be drawn to it.
Absolutely. Remember, this is a time of widespread poverty,
Okay.
a lot of social unrest. People are looking for
They're
answers.
going to change.
And Marx's critique of capitalism, it really resonated.
It spoke to them.
Yeah. Then, of course, you have World War I.
Right. The world kind of explodes.
Everything gets thrown into chaos.
And Russia.
Russia's especially in turmoil.
Yeah.
And this group of revolutionaries who've been inspired by Marx's ideas,
They see an
they
opportunity.
see their chance.
And boom.
The Russian Revolution happens.
The Russian Revolution.
And the Soviet Union is born.
The first attempt to put these ideas into practice on a large scale.
Exactly. The first communist state.
What a moment in history.
It was a turning point, for sure.
But I mean, creating a utopia, that's a lot harder than it sounds, right?
It's way harder than it sounds.
Things didn't exactly go as planned, I'm guessing.
Well, the Soviet Union definitely had its own set of problems.
So set of challenges.
It wasn't just about achieving economic equality,
There was more to it than that.
It was also about holding on to power,
Okay.
suppressing any dissent,
Right.
and just dealing with the practical realities of managing a huge, diverse country.
So you've got capitalism struggling with inequality.
Yeah,
And communism struggling with, well, everything else.
pretty much.
And then these two systems become the flagships
Yeah.
for these two global superpowers.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Talk about a rivalry.
This is where the Cold War comes in.
The Cold War.
This ideological battle that just dominates the second half of the 20th century.
It shaped the entire world, really.
It did.
And it wasn't just about the military stuff.
No.
It was about ideas, about values, about ways of life
The American dream.
versus
Right.
the promise of communist equality.
Like two totally different visions of the future.
Exactly.
So the world's a chessboard,
Okay.
and the stakes are unbelievably high.
The highest they've ever been.
How did this ideological battle play out beyond just the military stuff?
Well, it was everywhere, really.
Everywhere.
You had the space race.
Oh, yeah, the race to the moon,
It becomes this huge competition,
fueled by...
national pride,
Okay.
these competing visions of progress.
Right, who's going to get there first, who's going to be the most advanced.
Exactly. And then you've got things like Hollywood movies.
Oh, yeah, Hollywood.
Subtly and sometimes not so subtly,
Right.
promoting American values,
Right.
demonizing communism.
The Red Scare.
Yeah. Even the Olympics
Olympics
became this proxy battleground.
Wow, it must have felt like the world was holding its breath.
Just waiting to see if one wrong move would trigger a nuclear war.
It was a constant fear.
Was that fear legitimate? I mean, was that a real possibility?
Oh, absolutely. The threat of nuclear war was very real.
Very real.
Both sides had these massive stockpiles of weapons.
Weapons that could destroy the world.
Exactly. And that phrase, mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction.
It wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was the reality.
It was the terrifying reality of the time.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how one rivalry could cast such a long shadow over everything.
It affected everything.
But even as the Cold War is raging, both capitalism and communism are facing their own internal struggles.
Right.
They weren't exactly living up to their own ideal.
Oh, not at all.
So capitalism, for all its talk about freedom and opportunity, it was still plagued by inequality.
It was.
You have events like the Great Depression that expose the vulnerability of the system.
Exactly, the booms and busts.
Right, and then you have the Civil Rights Movement, which highlights the racism and discrimination
Absolutely.
that existed in this supposedly free society.
It exposed the hypocrisy.
And what about on the communist side? I mean, was the Soviet Union actually delivering on its promise of equality?
Well, not really.
Not really.
In practice, the Soviet system was often inefficient, corrupt, and there was a real lack of individual freedom.
So not the workers' paradise that it was supposed to be.
Not quite.
The gap between the ideal and the reality.
It was huge.
Huge.
And despite all of the talk about a classless society, there were still huge power imbalances in the Soviet Union.
Really? So even under communism, some people were more equal than others?
That's right. There were still elites, and there was still plenty of privilege.
So both systems had their problems.
Deep-seated problems.
Deep-seated problems. And the world was caught in the middle of this ideological battle.
A battle with incredibly high stakes.
Incredibly high stakes. So we're in the middle of this Cold War. Both capitalism and communism have their issues. But they're locked in this huge global struggle.
Right. It's a stalemate.
A stalemate. So what happens next?
Well, by the 1980s, the Cold War enters a new phase.
A new phase.
And two very different leaders take center stage.
Who are we talking about?
Ronald Reagan in the U.S.
Ronald Reagan?
And Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union.
Okay, two very different personalities.
Very different and very different approaches to the Cold War.
All right, so Reagan, the actor turned president. Famous for that line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Right, that was a pivotal moment.
He was a staunch anti-communist, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely.
True believer in capitalism.
And the American way.
The American way. So what was his strategy?
Well, Reagan was a hardliner.
Okay.
He believed that the Soviet Union was an evil empire that needed to be confronted head-on.
Okay, so he took a tough stance.
He did. He ramped up military spending, put a lot of pressure on the Soviet economy.
Which was already struggling.
Yeah, it was already showing cracks.
So he's trying to outspend them, outmuscle them?
In a way, yeah. But Reagan wasn't just focused on military might.
What else was he doing?
He was also championing a set of economic policies that came to be known as neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism. Now, that's a term we hear a lot these days.
It is. It gets thrown around a lot.
But what does it actually mean?
Well, it's a complex set of ideas.
Okay.
But in essence, neoliberalism emphasizes free markets, deregulation.
Less government intervention.
Exactly. Privatization.
Okay.
And the idea that the market is always the best way to allocate resources.
So less government, more free market, let the invisible hand do its thing.
That's the basic idea.
Okay, so that's Reagan's approach.
Yeah.
What about Gorbachev on the other side of the Iron Curtain?
Well, Gorbachev was facing a very different set of challenges.
Different challenges in the Soviet Union.
Right. I mean, he inherited a system that was in deep trouble.
In deep trouble.
Economically, politically, it was stagnating.
So he knew something had to change.
He did, and he knew it had to change drastically.
What did he do?
Well, he introduced these two key reforms.
Okay.
Glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost and perestroika, those are some big words.
They are, but they represent some pretty big ideas.
Break them down for me. What do they actually mean?
So glasnost basically means openness.
Openness.
More transparency in government.
So
more freedom of speech.
Allowing people to speak their mind.
Exactly. Allowing for more criticism or debate.
Perestroika.
Perestroika means restructuring.
Restructuring, okay.
It was about reforming the economy, making it more efficient.
So Less centralized planning, more market mechanisms.
Yeah, allowing for some elements of private enterprise.
Interesting. So Gorbachev's trying to kind of revitalize the Soviet system from within.
That was his hope.
Make it more competitive, more responsive to the people.
Yeah, they catch up with the West.
Catch up with the West. So you've got Reagan pushing capitalism to its limits.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev trying to give communism a makeover.
A 20th century makeover.
What were the results of these very different approaches?
Well, in a way, both of their strategies backfired. But with very different consequences.
Okay, so let's start with Reagan. How did his approach backfire?
Well, his policies definitely put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Contributed to its eventual collapse.
So in that sense, it worked.
It did. But Reagan's policies also contributed to rising inequality in the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
It's kind of ironic.
How so?
He was trying to demonstrate the superiority of capitalism,
Right.
But his policies ended up making some of its flaws even worse.
The gap between the rich and the poor got wider.
Exactly.
Okay, so even capitalism had its downsides.
It always has.
What about Gorbachev? I mean, his reforms were designed to save the Soviet Union.
Right, to make it stronger.
But they ended up having the opposite effect.
They did.
How?
Well, glasnost, this new openness,
Yeah.
It unleashed a torrent of criticism.
Criticism of the government.
Of the government of the Communist Party.
Okay.
And they just couldn't control it.
People had been silenced for so long.
For decades.
And suddenly they could speak their minds.
And they did.
What were they saying?
They were demanding more freedom.
More freedom.
More democracy, a better standard of living.
Wow, it's like opening a floodgate that you can't close.
It was, and it had a ripple effect throughout Eastern Europe.
And, of course, then you have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
An iconic moment.
An iconic moment.
A symbol of oppression crumbling.
The world watched in amazement.
It felt like a victory for freedom.
For democracy.
For the power of the people.
So the Cold War is over. Capitalism is triumphant.
The West declares victory.
End of story. Right. Everyone lives happily ever after.
If only it were that simple.
It's never that simple, is it?
Nope. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a whole new set of challenges.
New challenge.
All these former Soviet republics,
Yeah.
they had to figure out how to transition to capitalism.
Okay.
And it was a bumpy road for a lot of them.
A bumpy road? What do you mean?
Well, some countries embraced democracy and free markets,
Okay.
but others fell into corruption,
Corruption.
oligarchy.
So not everyone benefited from this transition?
Not at all. It was a very uneven process.
And what about the U.S.? Did capitalism emerge from the Cold War unscathed?
Well, remember that term neoliberalism we talked about?
Neoliberalism, you know?
It gained even more momentum after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Really? Why is that?
Well, there was this sense that capitalism had won.
It had proven itself.
Right. So the answer to every problem was more free markets, more deregulation, more globalization.
More.
Exactly. But this approach had its own set of unintended consequences.
So even in victory, capitalism was still wrestling with its own demons.
It seems like it always will.
But there's another major player in the story that we haven't mentioned much yet.
Who's that? China, the sleeping giant.
They went through their own transformation during this period, didn't they?
Absolutely. While the Soviet Union was imploding,
Okay.
China was quietly rising to become a global economic powerhouse.
A powerhouse.
Yeah, they took a very different path.
Different from the Soviet Union.
Very different. While the Soviet Union was clinging to this rigid form of communism,
Okay.
China was experimenting with its own blend of authoritarianism and state-led capitalism.
Interesting. So they were kind of playing both sides.
In a way, yeah.
How did they do that?
Well, they opened up to foreign investment.
Okay.
They embraced market reforms.
So they were adopting some elements of capitalism.
They were, but they
Wow.
maintained strict control over the political system.
So still a one-party state.
Absolutely. It was a very unique approach.
And it seems like it's been pretty successful for them.
It has. They've lifted millions of people out of poverty.
Wow.
They've become a major player on the world stage.
A major play.
They've really challenged a lot of assumptions about how economic development works.
So their model is like a hybrid.
It is a hybrid of authoritarianism and capitalism.
And it's working for them, at least for now.
It seems to be, but of course it's not without its problems.
What kind of problems?
Well, there are serious concerns about human rights,
Okay.
lack of democracy,
Right.
environmental sustainability.
Those are big issues.
They are, but China's model does show us that there's no one-size-fits-all solution
No one size fits all.
to economic and political development.
So where does this leave us? The Cold War is over,
Yeah.
but the debate about economic systems, about the best way to organize society, it's far from settled.
It's more complex than ever.
More complex than ever.
We don't have these clearly defined ideological blocks anymore.
Not like we used to.
It's not just capitalism versus communism.
There's more nuance?
There are shades of gray.
Shades of gray.
Hybrid systems.
Hybrid systems.
New challenges that neither system seems fully equipped to handle.
All right, so we've talked about the origins of capitalism and communism, the Cold War, the challenges of the 21st century.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, and it seems like both systems
Yeah.
have their strengths, they have their weaknesses.
For sure.
Neither one has all the answers.
Definitely not.
So where does that leave us? I mean, what are we supposed to do with all this information?
Well, I think it would be easy to just throw up our hands and say, it's too complicated.
Right, just give up.
Yeah, but I think the real takeaway here is that we need to be more critical.
More critical.
Of the systems we live in.
Regardless of our political beliefs.
Exactly. We can't just accept the status quo.
We need to ask tough questions.
Challenge assumptions.
Be open to new ideas.
Absolutely.
So question everything.
Yeah, pretty much.
But what are some specific questions we should be asking?
Well, I think a good place to start is by asking, what does a good society actually look like?
A good society, that's a big question.
It is, but it's an important one.
Okay, so how do we define a good society?
Well, what are the values that should guide us?
Values, okay.
Should we prioritize individual freedom above all else?
Right.
Is there a greater responsibility to the collective?
To the community, to society as a whole.
Exactly. How do we balance economic prosperity, environmental sustainability?
Right. Those two often seem to be at odds.
They do. And then there's the question of equality.
Equality. How do we make sure that everyone benefits from progress?
Not just a select few.
That's a big one.
It is. And there are no easy answers.
No easy answers. But it seems like we're moving away from this idea of just picking a side.
Yeah.
Capitalism or communism.
It's not that simple anymore.
It's more nuanced.
Way more nuanced.
We're starting to see the shades of gray.
Right, and the hybrid systems that exist.
The different ways that these ideas can be combined.
Yeah, it's a spectrum, not just 2 points on a line.
And you mentioned earlier some of the big challenges facing both capitalism and communism in the 21st century.
I did.
Climate change, automation, global inequality.
Those are the big ones.
They feel like defining issues of our time.
They are. And neither system seems to have a clear solution.
So let's talk about those a bit more, starting with climate change.
Okay.
You said that our current model of economic growth, which is at the heart of both capitalism and state-led capitalism.
Like in China.
It's incompatible with a sustainable future.
It is. We can't keep consuming and polluting at this rate.
Without facing serious consequences.
Catastrophic consequences.
So we need to rethink our relationship with growth.
We do.
But what are the alternatives?
That's the million-dollar question.
Is it even possible to have a thriving economy without constantly striving for more?
Well, there are a lot of people working on that right now.
Okay, so what are some of the ideas out there?
Well, some people are talking about a steady state economy.
Steady state, what does that mean?
It means focusing on quality of life.
Okay.
Well-being.
Instead of just
endless accumulation of stuff.
Right, so not just more.
Exactly.
Right.
What else?
There's the circular economy.
Circular economy, what's that?
It's about eliminating waste and pollution.
By
reusing and recycling resources.
So closing the loop.
Exactly. And then there's degrowth.
Degrowth. That sounds pretty radical.
It is. It challenges the idea that economic growth is always good.
That's a big shift in thinking.
It is, but it's a conversation that we need to have.
It seems like we're at a point where we need to consider some pretty big changes.
We do, if we want to avoid the worst of climate change.
Okay, so climate change is one big challenge.
It'll be one.
Automation.
Right, automation.
You said that this poses a threat to both capitalism and communism.
It does, because if robots and AI can do more and more of our jobs, what happens to the rest of us?
Right, what happens to the workers?
It could lead to mass unemployment, even greater inequality.
So a future where machines do all the work.
And a small elite owns everything.
That's a pretty bleak picture. It is, but it doesn't have to be that way.
So what can we do?
Well, there are ideas like universal basic income.
Universal basic income, what's that?
It's a guaranteed income for everyone.
Regardless of whether they have a job.
Exactly. It would provide a safety net.
Okay, what else?
Shorter work weeks.
So everyone works less.
And the work is shared more evenly.
Interesting.
And a greater emphasis on the care economy.
The care economy. What's that?
Jobs that involve caring for others.
Like healthcare, education, social work.
Exactly. Jobs that are valuable but often undervalued.
These are all big ideas.
They are, and they would require some major changes to our systems.
But it seems like we're running out of time to just tinker around the edges.
We need bold solutions.
Though to our listener, wherever you are in the world,
yeah,
whatever your beliefs might be,
we need you to be engaged,
informed, and open to new ideas.
The future is not set in stone.
It's up to all of us to shape it.
And the more we understand these systems,
the better equipped we'll be to make the right choices.
Choices that lead to a more just, sustainable, and prosperous world for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into capitalism versus communism.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. And we hope it's given you some food for thought.
And inspired you to keep exploring these ideas.
Because the conversation doesn't end here.
It's just the beginning.